This is not Trump's war. This is a war that should have never happened.
The U.S. president's patience is running thin. Washington's efforts to end the war in Ukraine are making little progress, and the Trump administration is threatening to walk away. Will the warning push Russia and Ukraine to engage seriously to end the conflict now in its third year? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. Before he took office, Donald Trump had said he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of entering the White House. But nearly 100 days into the presidency, he's made little headway. Moscow has rejected a 30-day ceasefire proposal. And Trump has butted heads with the Ukrainian President Volodomyr Zelenskyy, accusing him of starting the war. The Trump administration's soft stance towards Moscow and its suspension of military aid to Kyiv is worrying European allies. Meanwhile, the fighting continues unabated. Ukraine and Russia had agreed to stop attacks on energy facilities after separate talks with the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, but both sides accuse each other of violating that understanding. Trump is now threatening to abandon efforts to broker peace. Is it just that? Or a threat designed to pressure Presidents Vladimir Putin and Zelenskyy? And if the U.S. does walk away, how would it affect the EU's efforts to end the war in Ukraine? We'll put these questions to our guests shortly, but first, this report by Dmitry Medvedenko.
Washington wants results. Lack of progress in securing a Russia-Ukraine peace deal is frustrating Donald Trump, who once promised to end the war in just 24 hours. Now Trump says the U.S. might drop its mediation efforts, but stopped short of naming other measures to pressure the sides.
If for some reason one of the two parties makes it very difficult, we're just going to say you're foolish, you're fools, you're horrible people, and we're going to just take a pass. But hopefully we won't have to do that.
Russia and Ukraine took part in separate US-led peace talks in Saudi Arabia in the past 2 months, resulting in a limited ceasefire, with a pause in attacks at sea and against energy facilities. Moscow and Kyiv have accused each other of violating this ceasefire many times.
How close are we to the ceasefire is a big question to me personally, because, as I said, we had an attempt on a limited ceasefire on energy infrastructure, which was not observed by the Ukrainian side. So in these circumstances, to speak about ceasefire is simply unrealistic at this stage.
Ukraine is on the back foot after 3 years of fighting. Russia controls around 20% of its territory and wants those gains to be recognized, as well as an end to any plans for Ukraine to join NATO. Ukrainians say this is tantamount to capitulation and fear withdrawal of US support could spell defeat.
If we are not supported, Russia will understand it can go further, be even more aggressive. That is why everything possible needs to be done to support Ukraine. Put as much pressure as possible on Russia while supporting Ukraine so that it feels empowered during any negotiations.
Both Kyiv-controlled and Russian-controlled regions are tired of the fighting, with war weariness at its peak.
We are hoping they will sign a truce, and we are asking for God's help for all of this to end. We were praying to God when they were shelling us, and they were shelling us hard, but we are still alive.
As the mostly Christian country celebrates Easter, Ukrainians pray for a lasting peace, even as they disagree on what it will take to achieve it. Dmitry Medvedenko, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's now bring in our guest. Joining us from Moscow is Vladimir Sotnikov, an independent political scientist and an associate professor of international relations at the Higher School of Economics. In Alexandria in the U.S. state of Virginia is Donald Jensen. He's a former diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow who now teaches Russian foreign policy at Johns Hopkins University. And in Düsseldorf in Germany is Mattia, Nelles, a political analyst and the chief executive of the German-Ukrainian Bureau think tank. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for your time. Donald Jensen, over to you first. So, look, after promising a deal within 24 hours of taking office, there now seems to be some frustrations amongst President Trump as well as those in his administration that the negotiations aren't going anywhere. Is the U.S. about to walk away?
Well, I don't think President Trump has decided finally what to do yet, but certainly the discussion yesterday about that happening should be taken seriously. On the one hand, I think people like Secretary Rubio want that to be a prompt to further process and movement in the negotiations. But I have no doubt that other people around the president are really losing patience with Ukraine, with the whole process, and would like to move on. In fact, they were not particularly supportive of Ukraine to begin with. So we've got a number of voices around the president arguing various things. And the bottom line is that, in my personal view, President Trump's diplomatic initiative is not working. In fact, has failed. We've got to go to something else.
All right. Mattia Nelles, speaking of the Secretary of State, he said, Marco Rubio saying, we need to figure it out within a matter of days, whether this is doable in the short term. If it's not, then I think we're just going to move on. But I know that you have said that you certainly believe this is a pressure tactic. Do you think that this threat is going to bring some sort of breakthrough?
I'm afraid it will not, because the pressure is unilaterally focused on Kiev and not on Moscow. And we see that this hasn't changed the Russian calculus at all. And to my great disappointment, the US under Donald Trump has never tried to use any of the leverage that it has over Russia, whether it's economic sanctions, Russian central bank assets, or even military aid to Ukraine. It's simply tough on Ukraine and soft on Russia. And that Moscow sees as an invitation to stick to its maximalist war aims. So I'm afraid that if Trump is following up with this threat to walk away, then he simply will leave Ukraine weaker, and Putin is getting what he wants, which is control over Ukraine, and not just 4 regions or 5 regions, but all of Ukraine.
Vladimir, do you agree with that? And I mean, these words and these noises coming out of the U.S., are they reflecting the tension between Washington and Kyiv, or is there tension between Washington and Moscow?
Well, thank you very much for having me in your program. I would say that I'm also afraid that this peace plan, which Donald Trump just jumped to, won't work in the near future. Why? Because for example, there was a limited agreement on the abstaining from the shelling the energy structures, and Ukraine just doesn't observe this agreement. This is one thing. Another thing that still the both sides, I mean, Ukraine and Russia, they are very much far from any time sitting at the table and try to talk to each other. So this is also was promised by President Trump, as far as I'm concerned. But actually, it is not working. So I think that probably what could be done in this situation is that try to change the strategy for Donald Trump, his strategy of persuading both sides to start talking peace.
But Vladimir, look, I mean, Ukraine had previously agreed to that 30-day ceasefire proposal that the U.S. had put forward, right? And Russia was the one that was kind of slow-walking that proposal. And the perspective from Russia is that, look, they're winning on the battlefield, so they can put their conditions for any sort of peace agreement. So as a result, is the Kremlin going to be bothered at all if Donald Trump wants to walk away from this diplomatic path?
Yes. I think President Vladimir Putin will be very much concerned if President Trump will step away from this mediation effort. You know, I think that regarding your question about this 30 days ceasefire, I mean, the problem is that Russia doesn't believe Ukraine, that the Ukraine wouldn't be just rearming itself and then taking the time just to regaining the courage, regaining the force, and that to start shelling and to start fighting again. So I think this is logical. You know, for Moscow position, this is logical. You know, because the main problem actually that the both sides have a deep mistrust for each other. So why we can talk about any peace effort if there is such a deep distrust?
Mattia, go ahead. I see you wanting to comment.
I see that, first of all, Ukraine being the victim of this Russian war of aggression, it's trying to defend itself. And it's natural that any ceasefire whatsoever will be used by both sides to prepare a repulsion of a future invasion or aggression. That's natural, right? So that being used as a reason not to stick to a 30-day ceasefire by the Russian side shows how Putin is dragging its feet. And I'm quite frustrated that the Americans don't see through that and that they still view quite naively this interest of Putin to talk as not what it is. It is just simply buying time.
Mattia, do you see any scenario in which the U.S. administration takes steps to pressure Russia?
They certainly could. They could use this situation with lower oil prices to even increase the pressure on Putin and his regime to cut its revenues, right? We talked previously in Al Jazeera on the price cap on the Russian shadow fleet. Russia is vulnerable to this price fluctuation in oil, but the US hasn't even considered any pressure whatsoever. And hence, it's not being taken very seriously when it comes to Ukraine. It's simply not seen by Russia as an actor that is willing to use employ any leverage over Moscow and only pressuring the victim. And that simply doesn't yield any results, I'm afraid.
Donald, look, we now know that Kyiv and Washington have agreed to some sort of mineral deal framework, right? It's an agreement that reportedly would see the U.S. invest in Ukraine's recovery in return for a share of the country's future profits from its natural resources. This is just a framework so far, but if there was a minerals deal actually agreed, do you think the U.S. would stay involved and not walk away?
Well, I think we should read the text of the deal published yesterday, and it's vague, and it doesn't provide Ukraine with any of the security guarantees that it needs. To some extent, this reflects the broader priority with the Trump administration, which is to reopen commercial and business contacts with Moscow. That's not favored by most Americans, but that seems to be their highest priority. But if I could follow up with what Mattia said for a second, I think the Trump administration, as Westerners do often, simply misunderstands how Russia uses negotiations. They've often parroted, they being the West, has often parroted Russian disinformation, which is frankly not true, whether it's about the 5 territories or many other aspects of the war. And as we've talked about, this has given the perception that the Trump administration is leaning to Moscow, when in fact Moscow is the cause of the war.
And Donald, look, you as someone who negotiated in the past and who knows the Russians very well, I mean, this is all a discussion about a ceasefire, right? Talks haven't even gotten to the stage of a long-term sort of peace agreement. Do you think this was an effective strategy that the U.S. was employing?
It may be, but I think more likely they analogize for their own experience in negotiations in the business world primarily, they being the Trump administration, and sort of projected it onto how the Russians behave. And then, Frank, if you look at the Russian side, Dmitriev, Ushakov, General Beseda, Lavrov above all, these people are very experienced at maneuvering opponents, at using disinformation to advance their strategic objectives. Russia does not see negotiations as a win-win situation, as we'd say here. Russia sees negotiations just to get what they want, and that's certainly how they've been using it in the past 3 months.
Vladimir, should Washington turn its back on these peace efforts? We yet don't know how this is going to play out, but many say, look, this is going to leave Ukraine reliant on its European allies, right, to counter what's going on with Russia in Ukraine. How is Moscow viewing the role of the Europeans these days?
Very negatively. Just my brief answer, very negatively, because the Europeans are talking a lot about the so-called peacekeeping forces, and Moscow always was saying that it won't let any peacekeeping forces from Europe on the territory of Ukraine. Why? Because that means that the NATO forces will be very close to the Russian borders, even on the Ukrainian territory. So that means that this is practically unrealistic for Moscow. So, and regarding the suggestions and proposals on behalf of European nations probably joining the peaceful effort to stop the war. There are contradictory statements by French President and by German Chancellor about what they will do in case if Russia won't agree to their conditions. So this is practically unacceptable for Moscow. So I think that the negative, very negative attitude towards Europeans' attitude in this conflict.
Just Vladimir, just for the sake of clarity, this peacekeeping force that you speak of, are you referring to the what was called a quote-unquote reassurance force of international troops that was put forward by the British Prime Minister and the French President?
I'm sorry for my interruption. I'm referring to the troops which were suggested by French President François Mitterrand and then supported by the British Prime Minister.
Right. Okay. That's exactly it. Okay. Mattia, for European officials, from your point of view, I mean, how are they viewing all of this? Because there were recently talks in Paris where Rubio and Witkoff presented some sort of framework, right? Another framework for a potential peace deal to end the war. First, tell us, do you know anything about this framework and what it looks like?
The details are scarce, to be very honest. We know that Europeans want to keep the Americans involved, and they have to play ball with them. So that means applaud them for their negotiating efforts, for Witkoff going to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, but at the same time hedging their bets, preparing for the scenario that the Americans might walk away. So the Europeans are worried, and they're preparing for plan B, which is, quite frankly, very difficult to organize, very difficult to implement if we talk about the reassurance force. Yeah, which is what? The support of Ukraine in the short term. The most important is to keep Ukraine in the fight, enabled to withstand the Russian aggression. Otherwise, Russia will simply, in a few years down the road, invade and occupy all of Ukraine and thus threaten Europe as a whole. And then if Russia is successful, European peace order is destroyed and might makes right. Borders can be moved by force. And what lesson does that give to Xi or other autocrats around the world, right? So Europeans are rightly concerned, but they have very limited options to help Ukraine withstand the Russian aggression on their own.
Donald, look, there's been a transatlantic divide, right, between the U.S. and Europe, not only over this issue over Ukraine since President Trump took office, but also, as you know, most recently over the tariffs. So how do European leaders navigate this now? Because, I mean, they're trying to sort of compensate for the change in U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war under Trump, right, with these tensions with the president himself.
Well, the most prominent navigator is the Italian Prime Minister Meloni, who is in Washington this week, who is trying to act as a bridge between the U.S. and Europe. I think there's not going to be a cutoff of discussions, but there is going to be a markedly reduced U.S. involvement. And as Mattia said, it's welcome to see the Europeans try to step up, even though it's very difficult. But if I could add a point here, which is to say, I think that I don't see the Russians as, quote, winning. I think they have the upper hand, which is the language that General Cavalli used in his testimony, the NATO commander in his testimony to Congress 2 weeks ago. Russia has some very serious military weaknesses. We see that not only with the 1,000 people they're losing per day, but the fact that they now have Chinese and North Korean people trying to help out their war effort. It's a very brutal way Russia is campaigning. It's legitimate to say, when will they run out of bodies to put out there? And we all know that Putin does not want to have an official mobilization for the next round of Russian meat to be sent to the front, because that would be politically unpopular. So in many ways, I think the Ukrainians know this. I think the Europeans know this as well. And thus, when you see Ukraine step up with the very impressive drone production and use, that's hurting Russia. So I think we ought to be very careful before we send up the white flag and think that Russia's going to win this thing. It's to be determined. And we think we should probably have a little more balanced view of the Russian military effort, which does have the upper hand, but is not in any sense about to roll into Kyiv. That's not going to happen.
Okay, hang on. Let me bring in Mattia, because, Donald, you were just mentioning the Italian Prime Minister. I just want to get Mattia's view on Germany and what Germany does next, right? Because Germany, obviously a big voice for Europe. Do you see any change when it comes to Ukraine and this new German coalition? We know that earlier it sent more air defense missiles to Ukraine. Are they going to be more hawkish?
The incoming Chancellor Merz is certainly more hawkish in rhetoric, and the Ukrainians are hoping that this is followed up by substance, measured by the delivery of the Taurus missile, a very prominent example. But certainly Germany will continue to step up and join the coalition of the willing. In what shape is yet unclear. Germans are cautious about talking about deploying forces on Ukrainian soil. But the Germans are very important. Without them, without the industrial might, economic and military might, support for Ukraine is very difficult to imagine. But one more point here, the Ukrainians are certainly not losing this war, but they lack capabilities, as in Patriot interceptors, for instance. I was in Kiev last year when Russian missiles pounded in electricity power stations because the Ukrainians simply lacked interceptors. And these are means that the Europeans are simply not producing. So I'm worried about that. Not that the front lines will collapse, but that the Russians will be able to make gains in pounding the cities and the infrastructure again much more successfully than they're doing now.
Vladimir, is President Putin trying to buy more time to see if the Ukrainian army will buckle, perhaps, in the absence of U.S. military aid?
I don't think so. You see, that just there was a piece of news coming to my computer that President Putin announced the local truce, actually. That, I think, because of the Easter holidays. So, actually, I would say that Russia got what she wanted. I mean, these 5 regions about Mattia was mentioning in the beginning of this show. So, and Russia doesn't need to conquer all the territory of Ukraine. So I think that this is out of question. So I think that after these 3 years of war, when both Russia and Ukraine are much exhausted and there was a very high death toll, I think really Putin wants to make peace. On what conditions? This is the different story, because on the conditions which Ukraine wants and which European allies, NATO, are suggesting, Putin doesn't want this peace. So I think there should be found an answer to this very difficult question.
But with the announcement, Vladimir, of this 2-day ceasefire by President Putin over Easter, is that a chance to perhaps, is there a chance to build on that?
Why not? Why not? I think so. That probably, if there is a chance, so why wouldn't take it?
Okay, Donald, let me ask you about U.S. military aid. You touched upon military aid about the military situation, of Russia a moment ago. But when it comes to Ukraine, right? President Trump has not approved a single military aid package for Ukraine. The ones that were approved under President Biden, many say, look, these are going to run out eventually. So what demands can Kyiv continue to hang on to in the absence of U.S. military aid?
Well, my answer would be that if the Europeans stand up, as they appear to be trying to do, if Ukraine continues some of its more promising military developments, especially in technology and drone warfare, I think that this will likely go on for quite a while. But if I might add one more point, which we haven't talked about, I think that the Ukrainians have held back their attacks on domestic Russian targets to some extent, and that is to please first the Biden administration and also to satisfy the requirements of President Trump. I think you're probably going to see a much more open Ukrainian attack on some Russian targets, not civilian, but military and industrial targets, as one way to compensate for the perceived pullback of the United States. But I would make another point as well, which is to say that in the popular polls, the voting in Congress all suggests very strong continued support for Ukraine. And so that will be a constraint on the Trump administration trying to walk away. I don't think that the U.S. will cut off its relationship with Ukraine entirely, but I do think the Trump administration, as it's said many times, will try to cut back, to walk away. Whether that's possible within the political constraints under which Trump is operating in Washington, we'll just have to see.
Has the Trump administration, Donald, just a quick one to you, has the Trump administration, and specifically Steve Witkoff, overstretched himself, right? Because he's the one that's trying to negotiate the Ukraine war, the end of the Gaza war, the Iranian nuclear talks as well.
Well, one of the problems is that the Trump administration has about 6 or 7 people who are around the president, each with apparently different points of view. Rubio on the one hand, Lindsey Graham, not around Trump, but in the Senate, are very, very much pro-Ukraine, whereas Mr. Witkoff, his background is not in dealing with Russians on security issues. His background is something very different. And so one of the problems with this initiative by the Trump administration is it's apparently disorganized. Apparently, there's not one song coming out of Washington, and that has handicapped the Trump administration's ability to get what it wants. Again, I contrast with the Russian side, which has had some discordant notes, but is a lot more unified in terms of what they want. Unfortunately, what they want is not acceptable.
Mattia, must credit be given, though, where credit is due? I mean, ending wars can be complex and very time-consuming, as we're learning, but we would not have gotten to this point. Ukraine and Russia would not have gotten to this point, right, without Trump's pushing, despite progress being slow.
I'm not sure, but it's definitely laudable that Trump is trying to end the war, right? But it deserves scrutiny, what he's actually trying to do and what he has done and what he has achieved. As I was saying earlier, he has achieved little, and his carrot policy towards Russia has led to the opposite. It's led to more pressure on Ukraine being weakened. And when you talk about Easter ceasefire, for instance, Ukrainians are well aware, and I've been working on Ukraine for over 10, 12 years now, that ceasefires have been arranged and they've regularly been broken by Russia. So when we talk about ending this war, we have to focus on ensuring that Ukraine is in a position to deter a future Russian aggression. And whether it's about that, that's the most important aspect here. We need to focus on the 5 territories might not be regained by military force anytime soon, but Ukrainians are also certainly not willing to concede those officially. But Ukrainians are and had high hopes when Donald Trump came in, and they're increasingly being frustrated and disappointed by him.
Just very briefly, Mattia, final word for you. Just give us kind of your overview of the state of the war today in Ukraine.
The Ukrainians managed to fend off the Russians, even though they trade territory for Russian casualties. And it's really worth emphasizing that of the 1,500 casualties Russians inflicted every day, about 60-70% are inflicted by Ukrainian drones, by Ukrainian-made drones and mines. So, as Jacob was saying, it's really important that Ukraine has a capability to fend off the Russian advances, not entirely, but slowly, and to incur a high price. And the West ought to focus on how do we increase this price for Russia so that it simply cannot move forward, that this price is too high. And for that, we need to focus on really technical things, helping Ukraine, train the army, move maintenance further to the front lines, help Ukraine get more missiles, more interceptors. All these kind of military things are important for Ukraine to stay in the fight and for Russia to bear a cost which makes it impossible for it to move forward militarily and then come to the negotiating table in good faith. And I'm afraid we're far away from that in the short term.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you to all my guests, Vladimir Sotnikov, Donald Jensen, and Mattia Nelles. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.